most potent sovereign upon the terrestrial sphere, dwelt in absolute solitude within the most hushed chamber of the most magnificent palace humanity had ever erected, striking his brow repeatedly against the cold marble. This was no mere metaphor. It was no poetic figure of speech. It was literal truth. The Emperor Augustus, the adopted heir of Julius Caesar, the very man who had brought a definitive end to decades of ruinous civil strifes and transmuted the Roman Republic into an expansive empire, stretching from the arid Syrian deserts to the remote shores of Britannia, stood enveloped in darkness, utterly alone, beating his head against the stone wall and weeping with the unrestrained despair of a child. The chroniclers of Rome meticulously recorded the anguished words he shrieked into the palace's oppressive gloom. These were utterances that the senators, lingering in the adjacent corridors, overheard and whispered to one another with a profound amalgamation of terror and sheer disbelief. They were words that had never before escaped the lips of any Roman imperator, encapsulating the most catastrophic military disaster in the annals of Rome within a single, desperate lamentation. Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions. 3 elite Roman legions had vanished into the ether. They had not been vanquished in an open, honorable field of battle. They had not retreated to consolidate their ranks. They had not been captured to languish in captivity. They had simply dissolved. The 17th, the 18th, and the 19th legions, alongside their sacred imperial eagles, comprising approximately 20,000 souls, including legionaries, auxiliaries, and camp followers, had marched into the dense, primordial forests of Germania and ceased to exist. Not a single messenger had returned. No survivor had emerged to offer a coherent chronicle of the calamity. There remained only the absolute suffocating silence of 3 entire armies, swallowed whole by a dark, frigid wilderness, followed by fragmented rumors that drifted back like ash, each whisper more gruesome than the last, detailing the horrific desecrations the barbarians had inflicted upon the corpses. It was the year 9 of the Christian era, and the architect of what the Romans would forever dread as the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was no wild barbarian king. He was not an adversarial general forged in the martial traditions of the vast steppes or the open plains. He was a man who had been nurtured in the very heart of Rome. He had donned Roman armor. He had campaigned beneath the shadow of the Roman eagles. He had been decorated with Roman citizenship and elevated to the equestrian rank by the very empire he had just systematically dismantled. His name was Arminius, and his deeds over the course of 3 fateful days in September of that year constituted the most profound betrayal and the most brilliant strategic triumph ever recorded in the annals of ancient Europe. To comprehend the enigma of Arminius, one must first grasp the intricate Roman system of hostages, for he was a direct creation of this mechanism, turning it against its architect with a surgical precision that still commands the awe of modern military historians. Rome possessed an elegant yet ruthless methodology for securing the fidelity of conquered or pacified peoples along its frontiers. They would seize the offspring of tribal chieftains, the heirs, the young princes, and transport them to the heart of Rome. They were held not as slaves, but as honored guests. They were educated in the most prestigious academies, trained in the finest military disciplines, integrated into high Roman society, and bestowed with citizenship and noble titles. As they matured in Rome, mastering Latin, absorbing military tactics, and internalizing the philosophy and values of the empire, their fathers on the distant borders remained compliant, fully aware that any rebellion would bring immediate, lethal consequences upon their flesh and blood. It was a system of absolute subjugation, masquerading as sublime hospitality. And in the vast majority of instances, it functioned with admirable, chilling efficiency. Arminius was the son of Segimerus, the chieftain of the Cherusci, a Germanic tribe inhabiting the wild territories east of the Rhine River, within the dense, impenetrable woodlands the Romans designated as Germania Magna. He was taken to Rome in his youth as part of this hostage system, receiving a comprehensive education within the most sophisticated military machine of the ancient world. He was no primitive barbarian, clad in loincloths and wielding a crude stone axe. That was merely the caricature the Romans preferred to project upon their Germanic adversaries, to simplify their imperial narrative and justify their conquests. The reality of Arminius was radically different. He was a highly trained Roman officer. He had served with distinction in the Roman auxiliary forces in Pannonia, the region corresponding roughly to modern-day Hungary, where he had participated in active campaigns, commanded troops, and demonstrated sufficient prowess to be awarded not only Roman citizenship, but the prestigious title of eques, the equestrian order, which was one of the elevated echelons of Roman nobility. He understood the legions from the inside out. He was intimately acquainted with their tactical formations, their trumpet signals, their marching protocols, their camp routines, and their strengths and vulnerabilities. He understood the psychology of the legionaries, what inspired them, and what paralyzed them with fear. He knew the military regulations with the same effortless fluency as any career Roman officer. And he had returned to Germania, armed with this formidable reservoir of knowledge, carrying the accumulated wealth of his years of Roman service, and harboring a master plan he had patiently constructed over a span of time so vast that no one suspected a thing until it was entirely too late. What Arminius accomplished in the years preceding the year 9 of the Christian era was a feat that most strategists of that epoch would have deemed utterly impossible. He had unified the disparate Germanic tribes, not all of them, but a critical mass. The Cherusci, the Bructeri, the Marsi, the Sugambri, Tribes with long histories of bloody rivalries, speak in different dialects, and constantly warring over territories and resources. Arminius had personally visited the chieftains of each clan, negotiating, promising, and persuading. He had utilized Roman coin to secretly finance the weaponry and training of a unified coalition, and he had guarded this secret with a discipline that defied all imperial assumptions regarding the capacity of tribal peoples to maintain large-scale conspiracies. Not a single whisper reached Rome. No Roman spy, and Rome maintained a vast network of informants throughout Germania, detected the storm that was gathering. The man who had been trained by the Empire's own intelligence apparatus had learned precisely how it functioned, allowing him to remain entirely invisible to its gaze. The stage was set. Only the opportune moment remained to be chosen, and that moment depended entirely upon one man. Publius Quinctilius Varus was the quintessential political appointee, chosen not for his military genius, but for his political reliability. He was related to Augustus by marriage, a nobleman of ancient lineage with extensive experience in provincial administration, having governed Syria with an iron fist, proving his ability to extract heavy taxes and maintain order in pacified territories. Germania, in the estimation of Rome, in the year 9 of the Christian era, was deemed a virtually pacified territory. The tribes east of the Rhine had been subjugated or neutralized during the campaigns of the preceding years. The Roman presence was firmly established, trading posts were operational, and some of the tribal elites had even begun to adopt Roman customs and language. It was viewed as a frontier in the phase of consolidation, rather than an active theater of war. Varus was dispatched not as a warlord, but as a civil administrator. His mandate was to integrate Germania into the provincial architecture of the empire, to establish the Roman legal system, and to initiate the systematic collection of taxes that the Romans imposed upon all conquered lands. It was a bureaucratic endeavor, and Varus was, at his core, a highly competent bureaucrat. The fatal flaw in this appointment lay in treating Germania as though it were already Syria, acting as if the process of pacification were complete when, in truth, it was merely skin deep. The Germanic tribesmen who smiled at Varus in the trading posts and acquiesced to his administrative decrees still wore the same garments and obeyed the same tribal chieftains as they had before the arrival of Rome. This pacification was a superficial illusion, and Varus, possessing the characteristic disdain of a cultured Roman for peoples he deemed inferior, never bothered to peer beneath the surface. Arminius knew Varus intimately. He had dined at his table. He had participated in his council meetings. He had offered intelligence regarding other tribes, presenting himself as a steadfast ally, a thoroughly Romanized German who understood and respected the inherent superiority of imperial civilization. And Varus believed him implicitly, for Arminius was precisely the kind of barbarian the Romans adored, one who had learned to behave like a Roman. As summer waned, Varus prepared his army for the march back to their winter quarters in the camps along the Rhine. It was a routine march along an established route, with ample time to arrive before the autumn rains rendered the roads impassable. 20,000 men, accompanied by a vast train of civilians, carriages, baggage, and herds of livestock, set forth. It was then that Arminius arrived with urgent tidings. A minor tribe in the vicinity had supposedly rebelled, a localized disturbance, nothing the legions could not swiftly suppress, yet requiring immediate intervention. Furthermore, he suggested a shortcut through the forest that would shave days off their march. A shorter, more direct route that would deliver the army precisely where it needed to go with far greater efficiency. Yet a warning was sounded. Segestes, another Germanic chieftain who had genuinely embraced the Roman alliance and who was privy to Arminius's machinations, demanded an urgent audience with Varus. He declared outright that Arminius was a traitor, that the report of rebellion was a fabrication, and that the forest route was a deadly trap. He implored Varus to arrest Arminius on the spot and proceed along their original path. Varus listened to Segestes. He weighed the warning. Ultimately, he concluded that Segestes was merely motivated by personal tribal rivalries, attempting to wield Roman authority to destroy a local adversary. He dismissed the warning as an irrelevant internal dispute. The army marched into the forest. The Teutoburg Forest, situated in the region that today corresponds to northwestern Germany in the state of Lower Saxony, was not the sort of woodland depicted in the romantic paintings of the 19th century, with sun-dappled glades and paths carpeted in golden leaves. It was a dense, Stygian abyss, with ancient trees growing so closely together that in many places it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The ground was sodden and treacherous, riddled with bogs concealed beneath layers of vegetation that mimicked solid earth, until a human foot trod upon them and sank. The only existing paths were narrow trails utilized by local tribes, designed for small bands on foot, not for a massive military column of 20,000 souls, burdened with heavy carriages and cumbersome equipment. And then the heavens opened, and it began to rain. This was no gentle spring shower. It was the torrential, relentless downpour of the Germanic autumn, the kind of rain that falls for hours without surcease, transforming the earth into a quagmire, reducing visibility to mere paces, penetrating every crevice of armor, and rendering any object of leather or wood heavy and useless within a matter of hours. The Roman column had stretched for more than 15 kilometers through the heart of the forest. At the front, the vanguard hacked their way through the dense undergrowth. In the center marched the heavy infantry of the legionaries, burdened with their full kit. Interspersed among the soldiers were the civilians, merchants, slaves, officers' families, and wagons laden with equipment and provisions. At the very rear, the rear guard struggled desperately to maintain the pace of the march. It was impossible to see from the front of the column to its rear. There was no means to swiftly convey an order from the general to the units scattered along the line of march. This was a structure that had functioned flawlessly on open roads and level plains, where the column moved as a single, cohesive organism. Yet within the forest, it had fractured into a disconnected sequence of isolated groups, barely aware of what was transpiring a mere 100 meters away. At that critical juncture, Arminius departed from Varus's side, claiming he was going to rally reinforcements from allied tribes to assist with the local rebellion. He mounted his steed and vanished into the swirling mist between the trees. A few moments later, the eerie blare of Germanic war horns echoed through the forest. The sound was described by one of the exceedingly few Romans who survived to bear witness as something utterly unlike anything they had ever heard before. These were not the clear, disciplined tones of polished metal Roman trumpets, but primitive instruments fashioned from animal horns that produced long, undulating wails. These sounds multiplied and reverberated among the trees in such a manner that it was impossible to determine their origin or the number of foes. And then a lethal rain of arrows and javelins began to fall. They rained down from above, from the very canopy of the trees, where Germanic warriors had spent hours or days lying in wait. They struck from the flanks, from the thickets and dense foliage, where hundreds and then thousands of men had remained motionless in absolute silence as the Roman column marched past. They struck from the front, blocking any hope of advance. There was no direction from which projectiles did not fly, and there was no visible enemy to combat. For the Germans would strike, hurl their weapons, and melt back into the density of the forest before any Roman could react or identify a target. The Roman legionaries were counted among the finest soldiers of the ancient world. They possessed years of rigorous training, equipment of superb quality, and a discipline forged in campaigns across the Mediterranean and beyond. In open terrain, in formation, they were virtually invincible. Yet every single one of these advantages presupposed space to maneuver, visibility to identify the adversary, and firm ground upon which to maintain their formation. The forest, the mud, the rain, and the fog systematically neutralized every one of these advantages, and Arminius had selected this precise terrain for that very reason. On that first night within the forest, the Romans halted to pitch camp. Or rather, they attempted to do so. A Roman military camp was a marvel of engineering in its own right. A standardized fortress that any legion could construct within hours on suitable ground. Ditches, earthen ramparts, defensive positions, and an internal layout that permitted rapid mobilization. It was one of the primary elements that rendered the legions so formidable in prolonged campaigns. But constructing a standard Roman camp in waterlogged soil, in the pitch black, under a relentless downpour, while enduring intermittent guerrilla assaults from the surrounding gloom, was a task unlike anything the legionaries had ever trained for. They tried. They dug ditches that filled with water instantly. They attempted to pile earth that dissolved into mud in their hands. They labored with tools that weighed twice their normal weight due to the absorbed moisture, and as they worked, they heard the chilling sounds the Germans made in the darkness beyond the perimeter, noises calculated to prevent sleep and feed their terror. War cries, the rhythmic beating of tree trunks, and intermittent horn blasts. The Roman armor was beginning to weigh upon them in a different, agonizing manner. The lorica segmentata, the articulated iron plates protecting the legionaries' torsos, had been designed for campaigns under normal conditions. Under constant rain for hours, the iron began to rust, and this rust was not merely cosmetic. It locked the joints, rendering movements slow and rigid, while the weight of the water absorbed by the layers of leather and fabric beneath the armor significantly increased the physical exertion required for every motion. The Roman shields, constructed of layered wood and covered in leather, had absorbed so much water that they doubled in weight and were beginning to warp and disintegrate. The men who had entered the forest with pristine, functional equipment were now spending the night shivering in the mud, with armor rusting upon their bodies, listening to the sounds of death emanating from the darkness. They were unable to sleep, unable to eat properly, and utterly unable to determine where the enemy lay, or in which direction the exit from this green hell was situated. The second day commenced with Varus attempting to move the army toward what his officers identified as more open terrain, a potential exit from the forest. It was the correct decision, or it would have been, Had Arminius not anticipated this exact maneuver and positioned his warriors along every conceivable escape route, the assaults of the second day followed the same pattern, but with a refinement that rendered them far more devastating. The Germans had observed on the first day how the Romans reacted, which formations they attempted to adopt, and how they organized themselves when under fire. On the second day, they coordinated their attacks to exploit the points where the Roman reaction was slowest, where communication between units was most fractured, and where the terrain most severely restricted their options for retaliation. The formation of the testudo, the tortoise, wherein the legionaries huddled together with their shields forming a continuous canopy above and at the sides, was the standard Roman response to a deluge of missiles. Yet the testudo demands space to form, requires ground firm enough for men to move in perfect coordination, and necessitates shields that do not weigh twice their normal limit due to water absorption. In the waterlogged forest, in mud reaching their ankles, with shields beginning to fall apart, the testudo was impossible to execute in the manner their training prescribed. The Germans advanced in swift, agile bands, discharging their axes and spears into the heavy Roman infantry and retreating into the foliage, before any counter-formation could be organized. It was the absolute antithesis of everything the Romans had been trained to combat. And then came the third day, and with it, Calchries. The archaeologists who labored at the site of Calchries, discovered and systematically excavated beginning in the 1980s, unearthed something that transformed the understanding of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest from a mere historical account into concrete, physical evidence. They discovered the wall. These were not the ruins of some improvised barrier. It was a meticulously planned structure, erected weeks or months in advance, an earthen and wooden wall approximately 400 meters in length, camouflaged with the living vegetation, so that it appeared to be merely a natural part of the forest to any observer who did not know what to look for. It was constructed along the base of a hill, in a position that forced any column marching in that direction to pass through an extremely narrow corridor between the rising slope of the hill on one side and an impassable bog on the other. Arminius had constructed this wall months prior to the battle. He had identified the precise bottleneck where the Romans would eventually arrive, calculating that the relentless pressure of the preceding day's attacks would drive them in this direction, and had prepared the final trap with a foresight that demonstrates the staggering level of strategic planning behind the entire operation. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest did not begin in September of the year 9 of the Christian era, when the war horns first sounded. It had begun months earlier, when the first wooden pilings of the Calchries wall were driven into the soil of the Germanic forest, when the shattered remnants of the Roman legions arrived at the Calchries corridor. They arrived as what they truly were after 2 days of unremitting slaughter in the forest. Exhausted, disoriented bands with ruined equipment, devoid of effective communication, blindly following the only path that seemed to offer an escape. And then they collided with the wall. Behind the wall, shielded by the elevation, rested and well supplied with ammunition and space to maneuver, the Germanic warriors lay in wait. Before the Romans stood the insurmountable barrier of wood and earth. At their backs, the relentless attacks continued to press. On one side rose the steep hill. On the other lay the treacherous marsh, where any Roman attempting to flank the barrier sank immediately into the mire. No maneuver was possible. No formation could be held. None of the tactical solutions that Roman training had deeply ingrained into the muscle memory of every legionary could be applied to a situation where the physical space required to execute those solutions had been eliminated with surgical precision. Shields, weighing twice their normal limit, were lifted by arms that had endured 2 solid days of continuous combat. The mud reached their knees in certain stretches of the corridor. Men who fell into the mire clad in heavy iron armor were often unable to rise without assistance, and no assistance was forthcoming, for the men beside them were consumed by their own desperate struggle for survival. It was an architectural slaughterhouse, and Arminius had designed every single detail of it with the intimate knowledge of someone who had spent years studying how the Roman legions fought and what was required to render every one of their formidable strengths utterly useless. Publius Quinctilius Varus had reached the end of the line. He had so blindly ignored all warnings to cross. His generals were dead or dying. His legions had ceased to exist as functional military units. What remained were isolated clusters of soldiers fighting for their lives, devoid of coordination, devoid of leadership, and without the slightest prospect of reversing the unfolding catastrophe. Varus understood all too well what capture would entail. He had witnessed what the Romans did to captured barbarian chieftains, and he knew that the barbarians would inflict the equivalent upon Roman leaders. The historical records of prisoners from previous Germanic wars left no room for ambiguity regarding the horrific fate that awaited any Roman officer taken alive. He drew his sword and took his own life upon the field of battle. His senior officers followed suit, adhering to the Roman code of honor that preferred death on the field to the ignominy of captivity and the torture that would surely follow. And with the demise of the command structure, whatever remained of organizational cohesion within the legions vanished. The soldiers who were still capable of fighting fought only for themselves, without objective, without coordination, and without a shred of hope. The Germanic warriors swarmed into the corridor. The 3 sacred eagles of the legions were captured. This demands a moment of explanation regarding what such a loss signified to a Roman. For without this context, the profound symbolic weight of the event is lost. The legionary eagle, the aquila, was not a mere ornamental standard. It was the very soul of the legion, the physical incarnation of its honor and its institutional existence. To lose the eagle in battle was the deepest, most irredeemable humiliation a legion could suffer. Legions that lost their eagles were frequently disbanded, their numbers struck from the permanent military registers, as if that specific legion had never existed. The 17th, 18th, and 19th legions would never be reconstituted. Rome would never again employ those numbers. The 3 eagles of Teutoburg remained in Germania for decades. 2 were eventually recovered in subsequent punitive campaigns. The 3rd was never found, lost forever to the mists of time. 6 years later, in the year 15 of the Christian era, the Roman general Germanicus led a punitive expedition into Germania. One of the sights he encountered, or rather, that his soldiers stumbled upon as they advanced through the territories east of the Rhine, was the actual site of the battle. What the Roman historians recorded concerning this discovery remains one of the most somber and macabre portraits to survive from antiquity. The bones of the Roman soldiers still lay there 6 years later, for no one had buried the dead. Bleached bones scattered across the forest floor, skulls nailed to the trunks of trees along the paths the legions had trodden. Fragments of rusted armor lay half buried in the mud. There were crude, makeshift altars where, according to the records, some of the Roman officers captured alive had been ritually sacrificed to the dark Germanic deities. And there were mass graves where the Germans had discarded the remains of soldiers deemed unworthy even of the ritual of sacrifice. An anonymous mass of rusted bones, buried without ceremony or identification. Germanicus ordered that the bones be gathered and buried with proper military honors. The Roman soldiers who participated in this grim task had, in many cases, been born after the battle itself. They were burying men who had perished before they themselves had even learned to walk. And the historical records suggest that the psychological impact of what they witnessed, the sheer horrific scale of the slaughter, profoundly shook the morale of Germanicus's forces. The Teutoburg Forest was, 6 years later, a silent museum of Roman failure, and no Roman who visited that cursed place ever forgot it. The impact of Teutoburg upon Roman imperial policy was immediate and permanent. Augustus had envisioned the expansion of the empire as far as the Elbe River, establishing a more defensible eastern frontier and incorporating the Germanic territories into the Roman provincial structure. That expansion never came to pass. The frontier remained fixed at the Rhine. This decision, made in large part as a direct consequence of the trauma of Teutoburg, defined the map of Europe for centuries. The territories east of the Rhine were never Romanized in the manner that Gaul, Hispania, and Britannia were. The Germanic peoples inhabiting these lands maintained their tribal structures, their languages, and their traditions, untouched by the layer of Latinization that transformed Western Europe into something radically different. The dividing line between what would become Latin Europe and Germanic Europe, a line that can still be traced in the linguistics, architecture, legal traditions, and cultural boundaries of contemporary Europe, was largely defined by 3 days in September within a dark forest, and by a man who had learned the art of war from the very army he set out to destroy. Arminius had utilized the very knowledge Rome had bestowed upon him to engineer the only outcome Rome was utterly incapable of processing: a total, absolute defeat with no survivors left to offer a coherent narrative, in a terrain meticulously chosen to neutralize every single Roman advantage, executed with a precision that presupposed an intimate, esoteric understanding of the enemy. Arminius proved that the greatest army on earth is of no value when the battlefield is a labyrinth of mud and the enemy general understands your own military regulations better than you do. At Teutoburg, Rome learned that true terror does not wear armor. It dwells in the shadows of the forest. It speaks Latin without an accent. It dines with the very general it is destined to destroy, and it constructs the wall that will trap the legions months before any war horn sounds, because the most effective battle is the one that is already won before it even begins. Did you find this chronicle compelling? If so, leave your like, subscribe to our channel, and activate the notifications to journey with us once more into the mysteries of the past.